Every April 16th at exactly 8:11 a.m., Keanu Reeves walks alone into a forgotten cemetery. No cameras, no fans, just wild violets and tears. For 6 years, he's visited the grave of a 10-year-old girl no one has ever heard of. Who was she? And why does her memory haunt him more than any role ever could? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Every year, without fail, on April 16th at exactly 8:11 in the morning, a black motorcycle quietly pulls up to a small cemetery in Silver Lake, Los Angeles. The man who steps off isn't escorted. There are no photographers hiding behind hedges, no fans waiting for selfies. The world doesn't even notice. But the staff at Rosewood Cemetery do, because they've seen him before, 6 times now. Wearing worn boots, a plain charcoal jacket, and carrying a single bouquet of wild violets, Keanu Reeves walks through the iron gate. He nods politely at the groundskeeper if anyone's nearby, but he never stops to talk. His gaze is focused, heavy. He knows exactly where he's going. Down a winding path shaded by jacaranda trees, past the old Veterans Corner and a row of unmarked headstones. There, beneath a willow tree that sways gently in the morning breeze, lies a small, simple grave. Amelia Rivera, born April 16, 2012, there in shock. April 14, 2020, age 10, no epitaph, no photograph, just a child's name, her dates, and a stone so modest it could easily be missed if not for the flowers laid fresh every year. Always wild violets, the same kind that only bloom in early spring. Keanu kneels beside the grave. He places the bouquet carefully across the name, arranging it like someone who has done this before. He runs his fingers along the carved letters, brushing away a few fallen willow leaves. Then he sits, cross-legged in the grass, like a man much younger than his age. He doesn't speak at first. He just stares at the stone, like he's waiting for something. A memory, maybe, or permission. Then, quietly, he begins to talk. No one's close enough to hear, but if you were, you might catch fragments. He talks about filming, about music, about missing someone. Sometimes he smiles softly, as though remembering something small and perfect. Other times he wipes his face with his sleeve, his shoulders trembling. And then there are moments where he just falls silent, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the ground, like he's seeing something no one else can. It's a scene that repeats every year, same day, same time, same place. By 9:30 a.m., he always rises. He brushes the grass off his jacket, takes one last look at the grave. Then he whispers something, a sentence too soft for even the wind to catch. He walks back toward the gate, boots crunching the gravel path, and disappears down the hill on his bike without a word. To most people, Amelia Rivera is just another name among many. She's not listed in any biography, not mentioned in interviews. There are no headlines, no old news articles, no fan theories connecting her to Keanu Reeves. It's as if she never existed. And yet, for 6 years, Keanu has returned faithfully, each time with the same reverence and quiet ache as the first. Who was she? And why does this grave hold more meaning for one of the world's most beloved actors than any award or red carpet ever could? The cemetery isn't fancy. Rosewood is tucked behind a row of houses in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by eucalyptus and oak trees. There are no marble angels or gold-tipped statues here, just modest stones and weathered benches, a place for ordinary people to rest, the kind of place where someone goes to grieve without being seen. Which is exactly why Keanu chose it. He doesn't park near the front entrance. He pulls up beside the old maintenance shed near the back fence, where the view of the street is blocked by tall hedges. The motorcycle is quiet, electric, most likely. Its matte black finish gives nothing away, like the man himself. The cemetery's caretaker, Diego Santos, has worked there for 10 years. He's seen thousands of visitors. But this one always stood out, not because of who he was, but because of how he carried himself. Diego remembers the first time he saw him, April 16th, 6 years ago. He thought maybe it was a coincidence, a man visiting a relative, a fan of peace and solitude. But then the next year came, same date, same time, same grave. By the third year, Diego started wondering. He once tried to approach Keanu, just to say hello, maybe ask if he needed anything, but the look on the man's face stopped him. Not anger, not arrogance, just pain. A depth of grief Diego hadn't seen before, even among those who buried spouses or children. It was the way Keanu touched the stone, with such care, as if afraid it might disappear. What struck Diego most wasn't the sorrow, it was the consistency. Most people who grieve, they change over time. The pain dulls, the visits become less frequent. But not Keanu. He returns every April 16th like clockwork. Not a day early, not a minute late. Diego once timed it out of curiosity. Keanu arrived at 8:11 IMM on the dot, stayed for exactly 1 hour and 22 minutes, then left in silence. Every year since, the pattern has repeated with uncanny precision, as if there's something sacred in the ritual, or someone watching. And always, those violets. They're not store-bought, not the kind you find at a florist. They grow in the hills outside Los Angeles, in patches known only to hikers and botanists, which means Keanu doesn't just show up. He prepares, he finds them, he picks them, he brings them fresh. And each year, he lays them across the stone like a promise. Who is Amelia Rivera? The name isn't famous, the grave is small. But whatever happened between her and Keanu Reeves, it left an imprint so deep, he can't let go. And the world doesn't even know she existed. 6 years is a long time to keep a secret, especially in Hollywood, where nothing stays hidden forever. But this isn't a PR stunt. This isn't about fame or redemption. Keanu never speaks about Amelia in interviews. Her name has never appeared in print, on social media, or in fan forums. There are no Reddit threads theorizing a connection, no paparazzi photos capturing the visits. Only the staff at Rosewood know, and they don't talk. Because somehow, they know this visit is different. This isn't about an old friend or lost love. This is something more intimate, more haunting. The kind of connection that doesn't need to be explained to be felt. The kind that rewrites a person's soul. Last year, Diego noticed something else. After Keanu left, Diego walked by the grave. He wasn't trying to snoop, he just felt drawn. And that's when he saw it. Tucked gently behind the flowers, pressed against the headstone, was a small folded paper. Weathered, fragile, not addressed to anyone. Just a single word scribbled on the outside in careful handwriting. Still. He didn't open it, but the word stayed with him. Still. As in, still remembering, still grieving, still keeping a promise. That was the moment Diego knew this was more than a ritual. It was a vow. In a world where people forget easily, where names fade and graves grow cold, Keanu Reeves comes back, every year, without fail, for a little girl no one else remembers. But why? Who was she to him? A fan? A child from a charity hospital? Someone he met during filming? The theories swirl in Diego's mind, but none of them satisfy the question that won't leave him alone. Why this girl? Why this grave? Why violets? The questions have lingered like ghosts every year since. Diego never asked them out loud. But this year, something is different. There's a feeling in the air, sharp and still, like the moment before a storm. Keanu came today with the same quiet steps, the same bouquet, but as he walked past Diego this time, He paused for the briefest second, just long enough to meet his eyes. He'd nod. It wasn't much, but in that single moment, something passed between them. An unspoken understanding, a permission, maybe, or a warning. Because this time, Diego can feel it. The story is about to change, and whatever secret lies beneath that willow tree, it's about to be unearthed. Diego Santos had worked at Rosewood Cemetery for 7 years, but nothing had intrigued him more than the man who came once a year at precisely 8:11 in the morning, rain or shine, always carrying the same flowers. The first time Diego saw Keanu Reeves, he thought it might have been a dream. Movie stars didn't walk through forgotten graveyards with bouquets of hand-picked wild violets. Not without a camera crew, not without security. But there was no mistake. That was Keanu Reeves. The first time, Diego kept his distance. He watched from the maintenance shed, broom in hand, pretending to sweep the same patch of sidewalk he'd cleaned 3 times already. Keanu hadn't looked up once. Just walked straight to that same grave under the willow tree, sat down, talked to no one, left in silence. Diego hadn't thought much of it afterward. Celebrities had personal lives too. Maybe this was a relative, a friend? But then the second year came. Same day, same time, same violet flowers. Then came the third year, then the fourth. Each visit was exactly the same, down to the minute. Diego had started adjusting his break schedule to watch from a respectful distance, not because he wanted gossip, not because he craved answers, but because there was something about the sorrow in Keanu's eyes that stayed with him long after he left. Grief like that didn't lie. It wasn't casual, it wasn't performative, it was personal. One year, Keanu stayed longer than usual, almost 2 hours. Diego had been watering a hedge nearby when he heard him speak. A whisper, almost lost to the wind. I didn't forget. That was all, but it hit Diego like a stone to the chest. I didn't forget. There was weight in that voice, like a man keeping a promise, like someone holding on to something fragile, afraid the memory might slip away. After that, Diego couldn't stop thinking about the girl. Amelia Rivera, 10 years old, died just 2 days before her birthday. But there was no obituary, no flowers from family, no trinkets left by schoolmates. Nothing about the grave ever changed, except for the bouquet Keanu brought each year. No one else visited, ever. And yet, Keanu Reeves returned year after year, as if her name was etched not only into the stone, but into him. By the 6th year, Diego could no longer push aside the questions. Something about that grave, about that man's grief, didn't feel random. It felt sacred, specific, and deeply buried. So that night, when the gates were locked and the stars overhead flickered through the oak branches, Diego made a decision. He would find out who Amelia Rivera was, and why Keanu Reeves mourned her like his heart had never recovered. The next morning, Diego unlocked the cemetery office just after dawn. He passed the weathered filing cabinets that held the records of the dead, sheets of yellowed paper and brittle ink, silent witnesses to a century of grief. He made coffee, sat at the metal desk, and pulled a file marked Rivera Amelia from the R drawer. There wasn't much. Name, Amelia Rivera. Date of birth, April 16, 2012. Date of death, April 14, 2022. Age 10. Burial date, April 19, 2022. Plot location, Willow Garden, Section B. Payment, anonymous benefactor. Funeral service, private. Diego frowned. Anonymous. Always that word. Whoever had paid for her burial didn't want to be known. He flipped through the other forms. No next of kin listed, no funeral director notes beyond handled off-site. No photo attached to the plot paperwork, Just a scanned copy of a death certificate signed by a doctor from Cedars-Sinai. Heart failure, it said. But there was a handwritten note at the bottom of the file. Diego hadn't noticed it before. It read, "No flowers to be left by family. She would have liked violets." The handwriting was delicate, clean, definitely not part of the official forms. Violets. Diego sat back in his chair, heart racing. This wasn't coincidence. Someone knew that detail. Someone had made sure it would be remembered. He imagined Keanu Reeves reading that note, holding it in his hands, deciding right then that he'd be the one to remember her. Forever. He turned to the cemetery's digital system, hoping maybe someone had uploaded more details over the years. Most graves had at least a contact log or a visitor note. Someone asking about a family plot, a florist order, a genealogy request. But Amelia's digital file was blank. No inquiries, no relatives, no history. It was as if she'd appeared one day, died the next, and vanished from the world except for this tiny patch of grass and the man who kept coming back to see her. Diego tried online searches next. He looked up Amelia Rivera's name in obituaries, in school bulletins, even in accident reports from the spring of 2022. Nothing came up. No mentions in Los Angeles papers, no missing person notices, no school memorials. The name might as well have belonged to a ghost. That unsettled him more than anything. Even the forgotten usually leave a trace. But Amelia left none, except for the impression she made on Keanu Reeves. Diego's eyes drifted back to the one-word note scribbled on the folded paper he'd seen at the grave last year. Still grieving. Still remembering. Still hers? He didn't know. But whatever had bound this child to a world-famous actor, it had been enough to make him whisper promises to a stone, and enough to make Diego realize he couldn't stop now. Diego grabbed his jacket and headed across town to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. If the death certificate listed the hospital, maybe someone remembered the girl. Maybe a nurse, a clerk, or someone in pediatrics would recall a child named Amelia Rivera, especially if a celebrity had been involved. He waited 40 minutes at the records desk before a woman named Carla finally appeared and asked if he had proper identification. Diego explained he was a caretaker from Rosewood Cemetery and was trying to confirm records for a plot under review. Carla glanced at the name he had scribbled on the form. Amelia Rivera. She frowned, then shook her head slowly. "I don't think I've ever seen that name. Let me check." She disappeared behind the desk and returned a few minutes later with a puzzled look. "We have a file," she said, lowering her voice, "but it's locked, sealed by a private legal request. That's not common. Can you tell me anything?" Carla hesitated, then leaned in. "The only reason I even recognize the name is because of what the nurses used to say back then. There was a girl in pediatrics, young, quiet, always drawing. She was terminal. Nobody visited except for one man. He came at night. Always wore a cap, sunglasses, said he didn't want to cause a scene, but we all knew who it was." Diego's heart skipped. "Keanu Reeves?" Carla nodded, almost whispering. "We were told not to ask questions. The man paid for everything. Covered her treatment, bought books, art supplies, a private nurse. He sat with her for hours, sometimes reading, sometimes just holding her hand." Diego felt the air in his lungs shift. He had imagined grief, guessed at tragedy, but now it felt real, personal, painful. "What happened to her?" Carla looked down. "He passed away just before her birthday. They said her heart gave out. She'd been getting weaker for weeks." "And her family?" "No one came, just him." Diego thanked her and left, shaken. Back in his truck, he gripped the wheel and stared through the windshield at nothing. This wasn't charity. This wasn't fame. This was love, loss, a bond that defied blood. He thought about that whisper again. "I didn't forget." That wasn't something you said to a patient. That was something you said to someone who changed you. Maybe Diego would never know the full story, but one thing was now undeniable. Amelia Rivera had meant something to Keanu Reeves. Something profound, something buried, and no matter how many years passed, that little girl still lived on in the man who brought violets and sat quietly in the grass, remembering her not as a stranger, but as someone he had once promised to protect, even after she was gone. Back at Rosewood Cemetery, Diego sat at the small desk tucked in the corner of the office. The file cabinet drawer groaned open, and once again he pulled out the thin, fragile folder labeled Amelia Rivera. The air felt heavier this time. It was as if the story had started to breathe. The death certificate had already told him the basics. Amelia Rivera, born April 16, 2012, died April 14, 2022, age 10, terminal illness. But now Diego looked again with different eyes. Now he was looking for what wasn't said, what had been hidden between the lines. He flipped to the final page of the file, the burial authorization form. It had a signature. That was the first strange thing. Most anonymous donors left everything blank or hired someone else to handle the legal parts. But this document wasn't signed by a funeral home. It wasn't signed by a parent or a legal guardian. Just a single, quiet signature at the bottom in clean, controlled cursive. No printed name beside it, no contact number, just a signature. And it looked familiar, too familiar. Diego stared at it for several minutes. The penmanship had a distinct tilt. The K swooped high, almost artistic. The R looped slightly backward, like someone who had learned to write before typing became the norm. He remembered seeing something almost exactly like it before, years ago, on the back of a charity auction check that had made the rounds on social media. He opened his laptop and typed into the search bar, Keanu Reeves donation check signature. It didn't take long. There it was, a photo posted from an animal rescue organization that Keanu had once supported. He had written a personal check to fund a new wing of their veterinary clinic. His signature was posted as a thank you on their website, captioned, "A quiet hero." Diego pulled up the image and zoomed in. The K, the R, the slight space between the two names, the way the final S in Reeves dipped down instead of curling back up. They matched perfectly. Diego's stomach dropped. He grabbed the cemetery document and held it up to the screen. Same pen pressure, same line weight, same tiny curve at the end of the last letter. This was no coincidence. The anonymous signature on Amelia Rivera's burial form was Keanu Reeves. The realization hit Diego like thunder. This wasn't just a fan paying tribute. This wasn't a random act of kindness from a generous man. Keanu had paid for the funeral himself, quietly, personally. He hadn't hired someone to do it. He had walked into that moment of grief and signed it himself. Why, what had this little girl meant to him? What part of his life had she touched so deeply, so quietly, that the world never heard about it? Diego leaned back in his chair and whispered the name. Amelia Rivera. It still meant nothing to the public. But to Keanu, it meant everything. The following day, Diego returned to the office earlier than usual. The cemetery was silent, the willow tree casting long shadows across Amelia's plot. He passed it on his way in, carrying a fresh cup of coffee and something else. An old notebook he had started using to track what he called unofficial stories. Rosewood had its share of mysteries. People with no names, unmarked plots, whispered rumors from grieving families, but nothing like this. He flipped open the notebook and made a heading, Amelia Rivera, Section B, Grave 46. Underneath, he wrote a single question. Why Keanu? He'd decided to follow the paper trail backward. If Keanu had signed the burial authorization himself, then there had to be other places where his hand might have left a mark. He returned to the front desk, pulled the box marked April 2022 funeral records and spread the contents across the table. It was there, a receipt for the burial plot, $11,000. Paid in full, no installment plan, no delay. Payment method, certified check. Issuer, withheld. But attached to the receipt, Diego found a folded thank you card from the funeral director. It hadn't been addressed to the donor, just filed away, probably out of habit. But the handwriting inside wasn't the director's. It was too refined. It said, she wanted to see stars, but she got sickness instead. Thank you for giving her something beautiful. A friend. That word again. Friend. Never father, never uncle, never any name at all. Just someone who cared enough to make sure her final resting place was peaceful, and someone who, despite all his fame, had chosen to remain silent. Diego stared at the words, heart thudding in his chest. Who was this child to Keanu? He thought back to what Carla from Cedars-Sinai had said about the man who came at night, who brought books and whispered stories and stayed until the nurses had to gently ask him to leave. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who wasn't there to be thanked. He pulled out his phone and searched the dates again. April 2022, Los Angeles. Any mention of a young girl. Nothing had ever been published. No obituary. No school memorials. No fundraisers. She had vanished without the world even blinking. Unless the silence was intentional, unless Keanu himself had made sure no one found out. Diego flipped back through his notebook, scanning his notes. One phrase stood out more than any other now. I didn't forget. The words Keanu had whispered at the grave. Now Diego wondered if the real message wasn't about Amelia. Maybe it was about himself. Maybe he was the one who couldn't forget. Because somewhere, buried under the weight of stardom and solitude, was a moment that had changed him. And maybe Amelia was the only one who ever saw that moment for what it was. Diego closed the box of records and stepped outside into the morning light. The cemetery was still quiet, but something about it felt different now. He walked the long path, past the rose hedges, the old mausoleums, until he reached the willow again. Amelia's grave looked just as it always did. Modest. Peaceful. A small carved stone with her name, birth and death dates, and no inscription. Just the name. He knelt beside the stone and touched the edge of it gently, like Keanu had done. A name that meant nothing to the world. But something in Diego had changed, because now it meant something to him too. The cemetery was full of names, but this one held a story that had never been told, and maybe never would be, at least not out loud. But there were pieces now, glimpses, footprints of a truth too tender to speak, but too real to ignore. He took out a small plastic bag he'd brought with him, filled with wild violet seeds. He wasn't much of a gardener, but he remembered something Carla had said. How Keanu had always brought violets. How someone had scribbled a note, saying Amelia would have liked them. He dug a shallow groove along the side of the grave, just enough to lay the seeds gently in the soil. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something living. Something that would grow. Something she could have smiled at. When he finished, he sat on the grass for a while, just listening. The birds overhead, the distant hum of traffic, the gentle swaying of the willow branches, and the memory of a man kneeling here once a year, whispering, I didn't forget. Diego stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. He didn't know what came next. Maybe this was the end of the road. Maybe it wasn't his place to know more, but he had seen enough now to understand that Amelia hadn't just mattered. She had changed something in a man the whole world thought they knew. And Diego, once a quiet groundskeeper with no reason to care, now found himself changed too. He turned toward the office, feeling the weight of something new in his chest. The name Amelia Rivera still didn't show up in the news. Still didn't appear in any biography or press article. But to Keanu Reeves, she wasn't a story. She was a promise. And to Diego, she had become a reason to look deeper, a reason to wonder about the quiet grief carried by strangers, and a reason to believe that even in a world full of noise and forgetting, there were still places, small, silent places, where love endured without needing to be seen. 2 days later, Diego sat on the back step of the maintenance shed, tapping his fingers against the railing. He had stared at Amelia's grave for so long earlier that morning, he'd lost track of time. The violets hadn't bloomed yet, but the soil was dark and promising. Something had taken root. He took a deep breath, then pulled out his phone and scrolled to his cousin's contact. Rosa Santos, Children's Hospital Los Angeles, Pediatric Wing. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks, maybe longer. Life always got in the way, but now something deeper was calling him. And he couldn't ignore it anymore. He hit call. "Hello?" Rosa's voice was warm, but surprised. "Hey Rosa, it's Diego. Got a minute?" "For you, always. What's up?" He hesitated. "Do you remember any patients named Amelia Rivera? From about 2 years ago? 10 years old. Terminal illness." Rosa was quiet for a beat. "You said Rivera." "Yeah." There was another pause. "What are you asking, Diego?" He shifted, choosing his words carefully. "I work at Rosewood Cemetery now. I've been seeing this name for a while. Amelia Rivera. A little girl. Someone's been visiting her grave every April. A man, quiet, brings wild violets. Says nothing, just sits and talks to her like she meant the world. Sounds like a father." "I don't think he was," Diego said. "I think it was Keanu Reeves." The line went dead silent. Diego added, "I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen the records. He paid for her funeral. He signed the paperwork himself. No cameras, no credit, nothing in the news. Just him." Rosa exhaled softly, her voice a little shakier now. "You said Amelia, 10 years old?" "Yeah, April 14th, 2022. Rosa was silent again. Then, "Oh my God, I think I remember her." Diego sat forward, phone pressed tight. "There was a little girl named Amelia," Rosa said slowly. "She wasn't on my rotation, but everyone in the ward knew her. Bright, funny, curious. She was always reading." "Was she sick?" "Yeah. Leukodystrophy. Rare. It eats away at the white matter in the brain. There's no cure. She had maybe a year, and she knew it. She was so brave, Diego. Smarter than half the doctors on staff. She'd ask questions about her condition that no one wanted to answer." Diego swallowed. "Do you remember anything unusual about her last few weeks?" Rosa took a deep breath. "One day a visitor came in, not on any list, didn't want to sign a media waiver, said he just wanted to talk to her." Diego's pulse jumped. "Hamlet." Brought her a stack of books. Classic literature mostly. One was Hamlet. Another was The Tempest. The nurses teased him about it. Said, "What kind of movie star brings Shakespeare to a dying 10-year-old? Diego's voice cracked. "Shakespeare?" "Yes. And a music box." "A music box?" Diego repeated. "Yeah," Rosa said, her voice softening. "It wasn't one of those cheap ones either. It was made of carved walnut, hand-painted stars and moons. When she opened it, it played Clair de Lune." Diego pressed a hand to his chest. He had seen that very song mentioned once before, in a Reddit thread years ago about Keanu's favorite piano pieces. Clair de Lune had been #1. "Did the nurses know who he was?" Diego asked. Rosa hesitated. Some of them had their suspicions. He wore a hat and sunglasses, but we all know how hospitals work. Rumors spread like wildfire. Someone said he looked like Keanu Reeves, but no one confirmed it. He didn't sign autographs, didn't take selfies. and he asked that no photos be taken. And just showed up? Yeah? Spoke to Amelia like he knew her, but I don't think he did, not at first. I think he was told about her somehow. Diego leaned forward on the steps, his thoughts racing. How long was he there? Hours, Rosa said. He stayed past visiting hours. Nurses let it slide because, well, Amelia had stopped eating by then. She was fading fast. And that night, she laughed. For the first time in days, one nurse said they heard her say, "This was the best day of my life." Diego felt his eyes sting. She called him a philosopher, Rosa added. Told the night nurse he didn't talk to her like a sick kid. Said he told her stories that weren't about medicine or dying, just stories about people who kept going. Stories about love and rain, and how every person has a light inside. A lump rose in Diego's throat. I asked the nurse what he said when he left, Rosa continued. She said he whispered something before he closed the door. Something quiet. What did he say? Shan thought he said, "See you soon, brave one." The silence between them stretched. You really think it was Keanu Reeves? Rosa asked. I know it was, Diego said. He looked out over the graves, scanning the rows, until he spotted the willow tree, that soft place in the earth where something too big for words now rested. She meant something to him, Diego added, not just in passing, something deeper. Then why wouldn't he tell anyone? Because that's who he is, Diego said. Some people give to be seen. Others give because it hurts not to. Rosa went quiet again, and then her voice returned with a whisper. Diego? I think Amelia knew she was dying, and I think she wanted to die feeling like she still mattered. Diego nodded slowly, and he gave her that. That night, Diego couldn't sleep. The images swirled around his head like a storm. A little girl in a hospital bed, reading Shakespeare, a quiet man with tired eyes bringing her a music box, staying long after he had to, and a gravestone beneath a willow tree that had never once made a headline. At sunrise, he returned to Rosewood. The mist curled low across the grass, brushing against the rows of graves like fingers. Diego carried two things, a new violet plant still in its pot, and a printed copy of Clair de Lune on old sheet music paper. He knelt at Amelia's grave, placing the violet beside the stone. I know who your friend was, he whispered. I know he came back for you. The soil was damp, the wind soft. The cemetery had never felt more sacred. He unfolded the sheet music and laid it gently over the grave. You had one day with him, Diego said, and he spent 6 years trying to honor it. He didn't expect a reply, but something stirred in the branches above, and for a moment the sunlight pierced the fog just enough to touch the name on the stone. Amelia Rivera. Diego sat there for a long time, watching the light. Later that day, he called Rosa again. Do you think anyone at the hospital would still remember her? Some might. The nurses change, but there's a memory book we keep. You should come look. I will, Diego said. And Rosa, yeah? If I find that music box, I'll know for sure. You're really going to keep looking? Yes, Diego replied, because someone gave her the most beautiful day of her life, and someone has carried her name through silence every year since. He hung up, heart racing. The pieces were falling into place now. A terminal illness, a last-day visitor, Shakespeare, a music box, the exact date of death, a burial funded without cameras, without credit, and a man who, year after year, came back with violets and tears and a whisper only the dead could hear. Diego opened his notebook and scribbled a new heading across the top. Clair de Lune, April 14th. Handmade music box, Shakespeare books. And below it, see you soon, brave one. He circled the final phrase twice, then once more, because that wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. a vow that some part of Amelia still lived in the mind and heart of someone who had seen a spark in her, just for a day, and never let it go. Diego stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching the willow sway. The world may never know what happened in that hospital room. The white-haired man, but he, and so it seemed, would the man who never forgot. The next morning, Diego arrived early at Rosewood, long before the sun had fully risen. The cemetery was quiet, bathed in a faint gray light. Birds hadn't started singing yet. The air felt charged, like something unspoken was waiting. He walked straight to Amelia's grave, now adorned with fresh violets and a small laminated copy of the Clair de Lune sheet music, still lying gently against the headstone. He didn't speak this time, just stood and listened. There was something about that space. It no longer felt like just a place for mourning. It felt like the beginning of a story, one he had to finish. Later that afternoon, he sat in the small office by the maintenance shed, scrolling through online archives. He typed, "Amelia Rivera plus Children's Hospital, Los Angeles plus 2022 into every search bar he could find. Most links led nowhere. Some led to generic hospital donation drives, others to privacy-protected fundraisers. There was no obituary, no news story, no public record of her illness. But on page 6 of a forgotten volunteer blog, something caught his eye. The headline read, "The bravest 10-year-old I ever met." Posted May 3, 2022. The author was someone named Ellie L., a hospice volunteer who had worked short shifts reading stories to terminal patients. Diego clicked. The post opened to a long paragraph about a child named Amelia R., who loved poetry and could quote full passages from Shakespeare. It spoke of a handmade music box, of laughter in a hospital room that hadn't seen much joy in weeks. And at the bottom of the post, there was one blurry photo. Diego leaned closer. It showed a hospital room bathed in soft window light. A little girl lay propped up in bed, smiling. Her hands cradled something wooden with stars painted on the side. There was a nurse in the foreground, blurred mid-step. But what stopped Diego's breath was the background. Behind the bed, almost hidden in the shadows, a man sat in the corner, wearing a faded gray hoodie and a black ball cap pulled low. He was leaning forward, holding an open book. His head was tilted slightly, as if he was reading softly. His posture was familiar, gentle, full of care. You could barely see his face, but Diego knew it was him. He clicked the photo to enlarge it, zoomed again. It was grainy, the resolution wasn't great, but the profile, the curve of the jaw, the tired eyes, the way the man gripped the book with reverence, like it wasn't just paper but something holy. It was unmistakable. The caption beneath the image read, "Her favorite visitor. Came only once, stayed for hours. She asked for him every day after that." Diego's heart pounded. He sat back in his chair and stared at the photo for a long time. Then he reached for his notebook and wrote one word beneath the previous clues. Proof. That evening, Diego sent the link to Rosa with no explanation. A minute later, she called. "Where did you find that photo?" she asked, her voice tight. "Buried on a volunteer's blog. Posted a couple weeks after Amelia passed." "Diego, that's him. I don't care how blurry it is. That's Keanu Reeves." "I knew it," he whispered. "I just needed someone else to see it." Rosa hesitated. "You gonna show this to anyone?" "I don't know," he said. He clearly never wanted attention. But that girl, Amelia, she mattered. And people should know why. Diego sat in silence for a few moments, then pulled open a new tab and began looking into Ellie L., the blog author. It didn't take long. She had since moved to Chicago, according to her site's bio. Her last blog post was from a year ago, but she had an email listed for questions about hospice volunteering. He typed, "Hi Ellie, my name is Diego Santos. I work at Rosewood Cemetery in Los Angeles. I believe You once visited a young patient named Amelia Rivera at Children's Hospital in 2022. I saw your blog and the photo you shared. I was wondering if you could tell me anything more about that day, especially the man in the hoodie. I think he's been visiting her grave every year since. I hope to hear from you." He stared at the message for a long moment before clicking send. The response came faster than he expected. Less than an hour later, "Hi, Diego. I remember Amelia very clearly. I still think about her. I only met her twice, but she left a huge mark on me. That day, the man in the hoodie came in while I was reading to her. I didn't recognize him until later. He never introduced himself, but he stayed for hours, just sat there, reading poems and short stories. She looked at him like he was magic. After he left, she asked if I could come back the next day and bring more poetry. I did, but she passed away before I could read them to her. I've always wondered who he really was. But even if I didn't know his name, I know what he gave her." Diego sat frozen, rereading the words. "I know what he gave her." He pulled out his notebook again and flipped to the page he'd marked with Amelia's name. He drew a line from music box to books to photo to the final piece, the face in the corner. And then he wrote what Rosa had said the night before. "Some people give to be seen, others give because it hurts not to." He underlined it twice. That night, Diego didn't sleep again. His mind was racing, his heart caught between awe and sorrow. Somehow, through all of it, this had never been about the famous man. It had always been about the little girl who made him stay. The next morning, Diego printed the photo and taped it inside the shed, right above the faded map of the cemetery. He stood back and looked at it, not as a revelation, but as a reminder. He called Rosa again, his voice softer this time. "Do you think Amelia had any family? Anyone else who visited her?" "I think she was raised by her grandmother," Rosa said. "Her mom passed when she was a baby. Dad was never in the picture. The grandmother was old, maybe not even alive anymore. So it's possible," Diego said quietly, "that Keanu's the only one who visits." Rosa didn't speak. She didn't have to. Diego hung up, walked to the willow, and sat in the grass. It was still damp from morning dew, and the soil smelled of moss and memory. He spoke aloud, not to the wind, not to the trees, but to her. "I saw the photo, Amelia. I know who he was. And I know you knew too." He paused, letting the quiet answer. "I don't know what you said to him that day, but whatever it was, it stayed with him. It must have, because he keeps coming back." A breeze rustled the tree above, and one yellowed leaf fluttered down, landing on the music sheet beside the grave. Diego smiled. "You matter," he said. "To him, and now to me." That evening he returned to the office and stared at the photo once more. Her favorite visitor, a man who walked through fire most of his life, now sitting by a dying child and reading poetry like it could rewrite her fate. A man who had lost his own child once, decades ago, and perhaps saw something in Amelia that cracked open the place he'd buried his grief. Maybe that's why he'd brought her Shakespeare. Maybe that's why he'd made her a music box filled with stars and moons. Maybe he wasn't trying to save her. Maybe he was just trying to make sure she didn't feel alone when the end came. Diego turned off the lights and stepped outside. The moon hung low over the cemetery. He looked toward the willow again, where the violets now shone like little lanterns in the dark. He whispered one last word before heading home. Soon. He didn't know who he was speaking for, himself, Amelia, or Keanu. But it felt right. Some stories begin at the end. Some legacies are built in silence. And sometimes, the quietest photo in the corner of a blog holds more truth than 1,000 headlines. Diego sat at his desk with the printed photo still taped to the wall above him. The image haunted him. Not in a painful way, but in a way that refused to let go. The kind of image that carried a weight heavier than explanation. He had the blurry proof. He had Rosa's memory. He had Ellie's blog post. But he needed something more. He needed someone who had been there day after day, someone who had seen it all unfold up close. So he called the hospital. Rosa helped connect him with a former head nurse in the palliative care unit, someone who had worked there for nearly 25 years. Her name was Margaret Delano, Maggie to everyone who knew her. She'd retired in early 2023, but Rosa still had her number. Diego hesitated before dialing. Then he pressed call. A woman picked up on the third ring, her voice soft but firm. "Hello? Hi, is this Maggie Delano?" "Yes, who's calling?" "My name's Diego Santos. I'm the groundskeeper at Rosewood Cemetery. I know this is unexpected, but I was wondering if I could ask you about a patient you might have cared for. Her name was Amelia Rivera." There was a long pause. Then Maggie spoke, her voice quieter now. "Amelia, yes, I remember her." Diego swallowed. "I know this is personal, and I don't mean to intrude. I think someone's been visiting her grave every year, someone she meant a lot to. I found a photo and—" "You mean the man who used to come every Thursday?" That stopped Diego cold. "Yes," he said. "That man." She exhaled slowly, like the memory had been living in her chest for years. He was quiet, kind, always wore that same old ball cap, sat in the corner with a different book each time. Sometimes it was poetry, sometimes music theory, sometimes old children's stories. Amelia adored him. Did he ever say his name? Maggie laughed softly. "No, but I recognized him eventually. I didn't say anything, and he didn't act like a celebrity. He just showed up. Same time. Every Thursday for nearly 3 months." Diego scribbled the detail down in his notebook. "She had no one else?" he asked. "Just her grandmother, and even she was too frail to visit often. Most of the time, Amelia was alone. But he came." "Yes," Maggie said. "He came, rain or shine, sat with her for hours, listened when she talked about books or dreams. Brought her a music box once, one he said he made himself. She'd wind it up and close her eyes like she was hearing the stars." Diego felt a lump rise in his throat. "What happened when she passed?" The line went silent again. Then Maggie answered, her voice catching slightly. Out her hand, stayed until the last breath. And when it was over, he cried harder than anyone I've ever seen. Diego gripped the phone tighter. "Did he say anything?" Maggie's breath trembled. Aaron took a deep sigh of relief. "Helm," he said, "you're not alone." Over and over again, softly, like a lullaby. I don't think it was for her at that point. I think it was for himself. Diego closed his eyes, letting the words settle into the spaces behind his ribs. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said carefully, "but do you know who paid for the funeral?" "I do," Maggie replied. "It was anonymous, but the check had initials, and I recognized the handwriting. I'd seen it on a donation form once before, when he funded a reading program for pediatric patients. Same signature. It was him." Diego nodded, even though she couldn't see. "I always wanted to thank him," Maggie said, her voice distant, reflective. "Not for the money, but for the way he sat with her. So many people rush to fix things. But he didn't rush, he stayed. And that meant more than anything." "What was she like?" Diego asked gently. "She was brilliant," Maggie said without hesitation. "Loved words. Even when she could barely breathe, she'd ask for someone to read to her. Her favorite was Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? She said it made her feel like she still had time." Diego felt his throat tighten. "She once told me she wanted to be a writer," Maggie continued. "Said she was going to write stories that made people cry and then laugh and then cry again. I believed her. That little girl had more soul than most adults I've ever met." A soft pause lingered before Maggie added, "And he listened to all of it, never interrupted, never looked at his watch, just gave her his full presence, like she was the only person in the world." Diego let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said. "Truly. I don't know what you're doing with all this," Maggie said gently, "but if you're telling her story, tell it fully. Don't make it about him being a celebrity. Make it about the way he sat still, the way he made her feel seen." "I will," Diego promised. They hung up. He sat in the stillness of the shed, the weight of everything pressing around him like water. Every Thursday, poetry was a presence. It wasn't just that Keanu had visited, it was the way he had stayed. It was the silence he held, the way he never demanded anything, never needed thanks. The way he entered her world without trying to fix it, only to be part of it, and in doing so had changed it. That night, Diego returned to Amelia's grave. It was nearly midnight. The air was cool, the sky ink black with scattered stars. He brought nothing with him. No flowers, no candles, just a folding chair and a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. He had checked out from the library earlier that day. He sat by the willow tree and flipped to Sonnet 18. He began to read aloud. His voice wasn't theatrical. It cracked on the edges, uncertain. But as he read, he imagined her listening. That little girl with the music box. That little girl who saw beauty even as her body failed. When he finished the sonnet, he closed the book and looked at the headstone. "I don't think I've ever known someone like you, Amelia," he whispered, "and I never met you. But I think you helped a man heal something deep in himself. And I think you've changed me, too." He stood and placed the book beside the violets, tucking it under the edge of the stone to protect it from wind. Then he looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." The next day, he sent a message to Maggie. "Thank you for telling me everything. I won't make it about fame. I'll make it about her." She replied with a single line. That's all Amelia would have wanted. From that moment on, Diego kept a small record book just for her, a black leather-bound journal he tucked into his desk drawer. He didn't write facts or headlines. He wrote moments. April 16, 8:11 AME. He returned. Same cap, same flowers. May the 5th, 3:14 p.m. Left a folded paper under the stone. Didn't take anything with him. June 8, rain. He stood in it anyway. Each entry held no fanfare, no exaggeration, just truth. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that never make the news. And sometimes the loudest grief is the one carried in silence, year after year, by a man with a bouquet of violets and a heart full of memory. Maggie Delano sat quietly on the edge of her porch, a ceramic mug warming her hands as Diego flipped through the folder she had saved for over 6 years. She had kept it tucked away, beneath old hospice records and sympathy cards, uncertain why she had never thrown it out. But now, watching Diego's face as he handled each page with reverence, she realized why she had held on to it for so long. It wasn't just a story, it was Amelia's voice, her hope, her goodbye. She called it her masterpiece, Maggie said softly. The man who came back. Diego looked up. She wrote it herself? Every word, typed on an old laptop a volunteer brought in. Took her weeks. Her hands were weak from the chemo, but she refused to stop. Even when the tremors started, she kept writing. Diego turned a page carefully. The script was formatted like a real screenplay. There were characters, dialogue, even scene headings. The title page was smudged, like someone had held it with tears in their eyes. Beneath the title, in Amelia's handwriting, were the words, "For my friend, you kept your promise." Maggie nodded toward the end of the script. She finished it 3 days before she died. Told me it was her gift to him. Said he would understand. Diego read the final scene. A lonely man sits beside a child's grave, holding a letter in one hand and a small wooden music box in the other. He speaks to the wind, promising he'll return every year on her birthday, no matter where life takes him. The final line reads simply, "He came back." Diego's throat tightened. This is about him. Maggie's voice wavered. I think it always was. From the day he walked in, she saw him as something more than just a movie star. She said he felt like a character in one of her stories, a man made of grief and kindness. He glanced at Maggie. Do you remember the day she gave it to him? She nodded slowly. It was the night before she passed. He came later than usual, almost midnight. I let him stay. She was fading fast, but when she saw him, she lit up. She told him the ending was finished. Then she handed him the script and asked him if he would remember her. Diego's hands froze on the last page. And did he say yes? Maggie blinked back tears. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. Then he held her hand and cried with her. For a long time. Diego looked down at the fragile pages in his lap. The edges were curling. The ink faded slightly with time. But the story was alive. And it told the truth no record ever had. I think, Maggie whispered, that was the moment he became the man in her story. The next morning, Diego returned to the cemetery with the script tucked safely inside a clear folder. The pages were delicate, but the words felt immortal. As he stepped onto the soft grass of the children's section, his eyes were drawn immediately to the willow tree. The light was filtered through its long branches, casting dancing shadows on the stone that read, Amelia Rivera, April 16, 2012, April 14, 2022. He stood still for a moment, listening to the breeze. It was quiet, still, as if the world itself had paused to honor what had been lost. Diego walked to the base of the tree and sat down on the bench nearby. It was the same one where Keanu sat every April 16th. The bench was old and worn, one leg slightly uneven, but it had presence, weight, as if the grief that passed through it each year had carved its own shape into the wood. He opened the script again, this time focusing on the handwritten margin notes Amelia had left. One said, "Maybe he smiles here," next to a line where the man reads the girl's favorite story out loud. Another said, "Add music box sound, soft, almost like she's still there." Diego felt his chest tighten. These weren't just edits. They were instructions from memory. Echoes of a girl who knew she didn't have much time, but wanted her story to be more than a goodbye. That's when he remembered something else Maggie had said, something he hadn't paid much attention to until now. Sheen believed stories were the only way people truly stayed alive. He looked up at the gravestone again. Sheen was right, he said under his breath. A gentle voice startled him from behind. "Are you reading her story?" Diego turned around quickly. A woman stood a few feet away holding a bouquet of lavender and baby's breath. She looked to be in her early 40s, kind eyes, hair pulled back in a simple braid. "I'm sorry," Diego said quickly. "Are you family?" She shook her head. "No, I'm just someone who brings flowers to the kids, with no visitors." Diego looked at the bouquet in her hands, then back at the stone. "She had one. A visitor, I mean." The woman's eyes softened. "Keanu Reeves?" He nodded. "You knew?" "Everyone who works in the area knows. He comes early, parks by the east gate, never lets anyone near. I saw him once years ago. He looked like he was holding the world on his back." Diego held up the script. "She wrote this for him. It's why he keeps coming." The woman stepped forward, kneeling beside the gravestone. She touched the edge of the stone gently and whispered, "Then she's not forgotten." Diego looked back down at the script and knew something with absolute certainty. This wasn't just a story. It was a promise. Later that week, Diego sat alone in the caretaker's office, the script still resting on the desk in front of him. The pages were now enclosed in a protective binder, but it didn't feel like enough. Something inside him told him this story needed to go somewhere. Be seen, be felt, be honored, and not just by Keanu. He picked up the office phone and called Maggie again. "I've been thinking," he said. "I want to give it back to him. The script." There was silence on the other end for a moment. "Bill still comes every year, doesn't he?" Maggie finally asked. "Without fail." "Then, yes," she said. "But do it gently. He didn't want people to know about Amelia. He chose silence for a reason. I don't want to invade anything. I think it's time someone else knew the full story. Not the public, just him. As a reminder." Maggie paused again. "Then give it to him, with the only thing she ever asked for, the one thing that mattered most to her." Diego waited. "Her dream," Maggie whispered. "To be remembered, not as a patient, not as a tragedy, but as a writer." The next day, Diego wrote a short letter and sealed it in an envelope with the script. It read, "I believe this belongs to you. She wrote it for you, and only you. She saw in you something the rest of the world never would, someone who wouldn't forget. This story kept her going. I think it's kept you going too. She may be gone, but her words live. You kept your promise. With respect, Diego Santos." He tucked the envelope into a simple folder and kept it in the desk drawer until April 16th arrived. When the morning came, Diego did what he always did. Unlocked the gates early, made sure the path to the willow tree was clear, and stayed far enough away to give Keanu space. At exactly 8:11 a.m., the familiar black SUV pulled into the gravel lot. Keanu stepped out, wearing his usual faded jeans, dark hoodie, and ball cap pulled low. In his hands, the same small bouquet of wild violets. He walked with quiet purpose, as he always did, toward the tree. Diego watched from a distance, heart pounding. An hour passed. Keanu sat, head bowed, his hand resting gently on the stone. Then, as he stood to leave, Diego stepped forward from the shadows, not speaking, only holding out the folder. Keanu looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly in confusion. Then he saw the name on the front, Amelia Rivera. His breath caught. Diego nodded once. Keanu took the folder with both hands, pressed it to his chest, and walked back to his car without a word. But just before the door closed, he looked back, and for the first time in 7 years, he smiled. Ellen Tran had worked on dozens of movie sets over the years. As a production assistant, she'd fetched coffee, managed schedules, and kept egos in check. She'd seen actors at their worst, tantrums, breakdowns, vanishing acts. But Keanu Reeves was different. Quiet, punctual, kind. He thanked everyone by name, carried his own bags, sat with crew members during lunch instead of vanishing into some exclusive VIP tent. But there was something else, something unspoken. He had a ritual no one could quite explain. Every time they filmed, no matter the location, Keanu requested one small thing, a simple wooden shelf to be installed inside his trailer, just behind the door. No one asked why. Most assumed it was for a personal keepsake. But Ellen noticed the same manila folder appeared on that shelf every single shoot. It wasn't thick, just a few pages, maybe, but he always handled it with care. He placed it precisely in the center of the shelf each morning, and when the day was done, he slid it into a leather satchel and took it home with him. No one ever touched it until the Vancouver shoot. They were filming a drama in a remote mountain town. Weather delays, power outages, and endless reshoots had worn down the crew. Keanu remained patient through it all, though Ellen could see it in his eyes. He was tired. One afternoon, Ellen was asked to drop off a revised shooting schedule in his trailer. He wasn't there. The door was slightly ajar. She stepped in quietly, glancing around. Everything was neat. A worn duffel bag on the couch, a guitar leaning in the corner, an old paperback copy of Hamlet on the table, spine cracked. And there, on the shelf by the door, was the folder. Ellen had no intention of snooping, but something about the way it sat there, deliberate, sacred, drew her in. She stepped closer, telling herself she'd just glance at the title, just to see what it was. The folder was unsealed. She gently lifted the cover. A script, handwritten. The first page read in delicate, uneven cursive, "The Man Who Came Back," by Amelia R. Ellen froze. Amelia R.? The handwriting wasn't Keanu's. It looked like a child's. She flipped the page slowly. The next line read, "For the man who sat with me when no one else would." She felt a chill move through her. What was this? A fan letter? A tribute? But it didn't feel like that. The pages were carefully preserved, each one tucked into a plastic sleeve. She flipped to the third page. There was a crayon drawing attached. A little girl standing next to a tall man under a willow tree. Ellen's heart sank. She replaced the script exactly as she found it, her hands shaking slightly. As she turned to leave, she heard the trailer door creak. Keanu was standing there. He didn't speak, just looked at her with a mix of calm and sorrow. She opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could, he nodded gently. Then, without a word, he stepped past her, lifted the script from the shelf, and held it against his chest. Ellen backed out slowly, heart pounding. She expected to be fired on the spot. But Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold her. He just sat on the small couch, script in hand, as if her intrusion didn't change a thing. The next morning, Ellen found a small note on her call sheet. "Some stories don't belong on screen, they belong in silence. Thank you for being gentle." That was it. No signature. But she didn't need one. From that moment on, she understood. The script wasn't just a keepsake. It was a vow. A quiet promise carried across time and space. Every scene he acted, every line he delivered, somehow came from that silent place in his trailer, the place where a little girl's handwriting lived. Ellen began noticing other things. When a child visited the set, Keanu would kneel to their level, ask their name, and genuinely listen. He always kept a box of children's books nearby, as if he might suddenly find himself reading aloud. He offered small acts of kindness that seemed unconnected, until you knew about the script. One day, during a long night shoot, the cast and crew were exhausted. Tensions flared. Someone snapped at a grip for misplacing a prop. Another cursed when the generator failed. But Keanu remained calm. He walked to the side of the set, pulled out the old manila folder, and read it in the glow of his phone light. Just for a minute. Then he came back, quiet and grounded, and helped carry sandbags to stabilize a camera dolly. No one understood why an A-list actor was doing grunt work. But Ellen knew. He wasn't just honoring Amelia's story, he was living it. A week later, one of the stunt doubles twisted her ankle during rehearsal. She was young, fresh out of training, embarrassed beyond belief. While medics checked her leg, Keanu sat beside her on the curb. He didn't talk about movies, or money, or fame. He asked if she liked to write. The stunt double nodded through tears, caught off guard. "I knew someone who wrote beautiful things," Keanu said gently. "She once told me the best stories come from pain you survive." The young woman never forgot that moment. Neither did Ellen. The final week of shooting brought torrential rain. The set flooded. Trailers had to be moved. Ellen volunteered to pack up Keanu's space, assuming he wouldn't mind. When she opened the door, the shelf was already empty. The script was gone. In its place, a folded piece of notebook paper lay on the shelf. In tiny, perfect handwriting, it said, "Thank you for remembering me." Ellen stared at it for a long time, unsure if it was new or old, if it was from Amelia or Keanu, or both. Ellen kept the note, not out of selfishness, but because something in her heart told her it wasn't meant to be left behind. She tucked it into her journal, between pages filled with her own writing. Unfinished poems, story fragments, questions she was still learning how to ask. From that day on, she made a silent vow to create with intention, to treat her work as sacred, to remember that behind every script, every performance, every costume change, there might be a child's dream waiting to live again. Years passed. Ellen climbed the ranks, working on larger productions, moving from assistant to coordinator and eventually producer. But on every set, she noticed how people whispered about Keanu, not for his stardom, not for his fame, but for the quiet things. The way he waited in silence during lunch breaks, the way he seemed to find the loneliest person on set and ask how their day was going, the way he read paperback novels under trees while everyone else scrolled their phones. Once, on a studio lot in Atlanta, Ellen ran into him again. She hadn't seen him in years. He remembered her name, asked about her family. Then, as he turned to leave, he said quietly, "You still carry it, don't you?" Ellen didn't need to ask what it was. She nodded. Keanu smiled, barely. "She'd be proud," he said. That was all. He walked away without another word, leaving Ellen with tears in her eyes and a renewed sense of purpose. Later that night, Ellen went home and pulled out her old journal. The note was still there. The ink hadn't faded. The lines were as steady as the first day she saw them. She didn't know how many people had seen that script. She didn't know if Keanu had ever told anyone else. But she knew this. He was keeping a promise to a little girl named Amelia Rivera, and the world would never know unless someone chose to tell the truth, gently, faithfully, and without spectacle. That night, Ellen sat at her desk, opened a blank document, and began to write. She started with the title, "The Man Who Came Back," and under it, in quiet tribute, "Inspired by a dream that never asked to be famous, only remembered." The story wasn't finished, but it had never truly ended either, because some stories don't fade. They wait, in trailers, in folded notes, and in the quiet hearts of those who remember. Emily Tran had always followed Keanu Reeves, not just as a fan, but as a journalist fascinated by paradoxes. Here was one of the most recognizable actors on the planet, yet he moved through the world like a ghost. He donated millions without seeking headlines. He waited in lines like everyone else. He avoided attention at all costs. She had written about celebrities before. Most stories involved scandal or spectacle, but Keanu's silence had always intrigued her. It wasn't calculated. It felt earned, and somehow deeply sad. So when an anonymous tip landed in her inbox, subject line, "The girl he visits," Emily almost dismissed it. But the body of the email was brief and chilling. Silver Lake Cemetery, April 16th. Keanu Reeves, same grave. Every year. Attached was a blurry photo. Keanu alone beneath a willow tree, a bouquet of wild violets in his hand. The photo looked recent, maybe a few days old. No paparazzi, no entourage. Just him. Emily enlarged the image. The gravestone was partially visible behind him. Amelia Rivera, age 10. Her heart stuttered. The date on the headstone was April 14, 2022. The girl had died just shy of her birthday. Emily felt a tug in her chest. Something about the way Keanu sat there, shoulders bent, hands folded in stillness, spoke of a grief that hadn't moved on. She opened a new document on her laptop and typed one sentence. Who is Amelia Rivera, and why does Keanu Reeves grieve her every year? She didn't want to exploit it. That wasn't her goal. This wasn't a headline. It was a question that deserved a quiet, careful answer. The kind of story you whisper into someone's hands, not blast across the internet. The next morning, she drove to Silver Lake Cemetery. It was early. The sun filtered through cypress trees. The air was still cool. She didn't bring a camera, just a notepad, a scarf, and a promise not to ask questions that hurt. Inside the small office near the entrance, she met Diego Santos. He looked surprised to see her. "You with the press?" he asked cautiously. Emily hesitated. "Yes, but I'm not here to write a scandal. I'm here to understand." Diego studied her face. She didn't look like a gossip writer. She looked tired and honest. He nodded toward the back of the cemetery. Row 7, third stone under the willow. I'm not here for a photo, she said. I'm here for the story behind it. For a long moment, Diego didn't say anything. Then he stepped back inside the office and returned with a small manila folder. Then you need to know this, he said, handing it to her. Inside was a printout of Amelia's burial record. Date of death, date of burial, cause, no listed family. But the payment line said everything. Paid in full by anonymous benefactor. Emily blinked. Do you know who? Diego nodded slowly. I do now. Diego hesitated, then leaned against the doorway, folding his arms. Look, I wasn't going to say anything at first. It felt sacred. But after 6 years of watching him sit there, talking to that little stone like she was still listening, I started asking questions. Emily kept her voice soft. And you found answers. I did, slowly, one record at a time. He explained how he'd cross-checked the signature on the burial form, how he noticed it matched a check Keanu once wrote publicly for a leukemia fund. The loops, the tilt, the pressure on the M&R, it was unmistakable. Emily listened, scribbling notes, but her hands trembled. Not out of shock, out of sorrow. She could already feel the outline of the story forming, grief, compassion, secrecy. But she still didn't understand the connection. What else do you know about the girl? She asked. Diego stepped aside and pointed to the path behind the office. You'll want to talk to Maggie Delano. She was Amelia's nurse. Retired now, but she remembers everything. Where can I find her? Diego wrote down an address in Westwood and handed it to Emily. She told me once, Keanu cried harder than anyone she'd ever seen. And she's worked hospice for 30 years. Emily's breath caught. He really knew her, didn't he? Diego nodded. He didn't just know her, he carried her. Emily thanked him and left the cemetery quietly. The spring air felt heavier now, filled with weight that didn't belong to her but somehow pressed against her shoulders anyway. An hour later, she stood outside a modest home tucked between apartment buildings in Westwood. A small porch, garden gnomes, the kind of place where real stories lived. Maggie Delano opened the door before Emily even knocked. You the one Diego sent? I am. You here for gossip or truth? Truth, Emily said. Maggie stepped aside. Then come in. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Maggie poured 2 cups of tea without asking and settled into a worn armchair across from Emily. She was 10, she began. No parents, just a caseworker who visited once a week and a chart full of diagnoses no child should ever see. She didn't complain, not once. She smiled, every single day. Emily didn't interrupt. Then one afternoon this man walks in. No cameras, no fuss, just a soft voice and a box of books. Keanu? Emily whispered. Maggie nodded. He sat by her bed for hours, read to her, asked her what she wanted to be. She told him she wanted to write movies, that she had a script. Emily leaned forward. Did she give it to him? Maggie smiled, eyes glistening. She did. The man who came back? I handed it to him the night she passed. Emily stared down at her notebook, barely able to see the page through the tears blurring her vision. This wasn't just a story. It was a legacy buried in silence, quietly protected by a man who asked for no credit and expected no thanks. What did he say when you gave it to him? She asked gently. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, summoning the memory. Hell didn't speak. He just held it against his chest and nodded. Then he kissed Amelia's forehead and whispered something I couldn't hear. The room was quiet. Next morning, Maggie said, the bill for everything, transport, burial, headstone, was paid in full. The receipt didn't have a name, but I knew who it was. He never came back to the hospice, but every April after, I visited the cemetery and saw fresh violets by her grave. Emily's pen stilled. Fresh violets. The same kind that appeared in the blurred photo? The same kind Diego said he saw Keanu place every year without fail. You're going to write about this? Maggie asked. Emily hesitated. Yes, But not to exploit him, not to expose him. I want people to understand the kind of love that doesn't ask for recognition, that just gives and remembers. Maggie nodded as if she had hoped for that answer all along. "I only ask one thing," she said, her voice firm. "Don't forget Amelia." "I won't," Emily promised. "She's the heart of this." That night, Emily spread out all her notes on the floor of her small apartment. Burial records, hospice testimonials, photos, witness accounts, and, at the center, a name nearly lost to time: Amelia Rivera. A girl with no family, no headlines, no foundation in her name. Just a dream, a story, and a promise from a stranger who became something more than a visitor. A man who returned every single year. Emily knew what she had to do next. She didn't need Keanu's confirmation. She didn't need a quote or a press statement. The truth had already been told, piece by piece, in the way he showed up when no one else did. She opened a new document and typed the title carefully. "The Man Who Came Back: The Story Behind Keanu Reeves's Silent Promise." She stared at it for a long moment, then deleted his name from the headline. Instead, she typed, "The Girl with the Story No One Told," because this wasn't about fame. It was about a little girl who dreamed, a man who listened, and a love that never needed an audience. Emily Tran hadn't expected a response when she sent the request. It was a long shot, a message fired off into the digital void, addressed to a retired case manager who had once worked at the Department of Child and Family Services. But just 3 days later, an envelope arrived at her office with no return address. Inside was a thin file folder, slightly worn, and a yellow sticky note attached to the front that read, "Use with respect. She deserved more." Emily opened it with trembling hands. At the top of the first page, client name Amelia Rivera, Dobb, April 16, 2012, status, deceased. Beneath the typed lines were columns of dates and observations, the kind of cold administrative language meant to track a life but never capture one. Age 6. Placed in emergency foster care after being found alone in an apartment. Malnourished. No known parental contact. No next of kin. No school enrollment. No medical records prior to intake. For 2 years, Amelia had moved between homes, never staying longer than a few months. She was described as quiet, intelligent, unusually polite. One entry, dated November 2019, simply read, "Draws stories. Doesn't speak much." Emily flipped through the pages, her throat tightening. This wasn't just a case file. This was a silent record of a child no one had claimed. A girl who had spent most of her short life waiting for someone to see her. But then something changed. A new section began in early 2022. It was labeled Hospice Referral Terminal Case. Emily's eyes lingered on the words, hospice, terminal. She read the notes slowly, each line heavier than the last. Diagnosis, inoperable brain tumor. Prognosis, 3 to 6 months. Referral location, Cedarwood Pediatric Hospice, Silver Lake. The date of admission was February 3, 2022. Then came a note that nearly made Emily stop breathing. Written in shaky red pen at the bottom of the page, not part of the printed forms, new volunteer, KR, visits weekly, she laughs again. KR. Emily stared at the letters. There it was, tucked away in a forgotten file that had never been digitized, buried behind bureaucratic reports and form templates. Proof that Keanu Reeves had been there. Not for publicity, not for attention, but because of her. Because of Amelia. The entries continued. Week after week, a new notation. KR brought books today. KR sat with her during the storm. KR helped her finish a story script she was writing. She calls him her friend. But the final page was what undid Emily completely. It wasn't typed. It wasn't a report. It was a letter. Handwritten in purple marker on lined paper, folded once and paper-clipped to the back of the file. Emily opened it carefully, her fingers shaking. The letter began with uneven handwriting, the kind you might expect from a 10-year-old who had spent more time with books than people. "Dear whoever reads this," it began, "I don't know if I'll be around when you do, but I wanted to say thank you." Emily's eyes filled as she continued, "Thank you for reading my story. Not the one in this folder, not the sad one. I mean the story I wrote, the one about the man who comes back. It's not a long story, but it's the one I'm proud of, because I finished it." The lines wavered here and there, but the words were determined. You could feel the little girl's effort in every sentence, like she was writing with her whole heart. Didn't think anyone would care about me or my stories, but then he came. There was no name, no need. Emily already knew. Hell didn't talk too much, but he listened, really listened. He brought me a book of poems and read the funny ones. He said I was brave, even though I was scared all the time. He helped me fix the ending of my story. He said it deserved one. A tear slipped down Emily's cheek. She wiped it quickly, afraid it might smudge the fading ink. I don't know why he came. Maybe he saw my name. Maybe someone told him, or maybe he just knew that I was waiting, that I was hoping, that someone would see me before I was gone. Emily paused. She felt a weight pressing on her chest. Not grief, exactly, but something more intricate. A recognition. This girl had written something timeless in the most fleeting moment of her life. "If I don't make it," the letter went on, "please tell him I'm not scared anymore. Not because the sickness went away, but because he made me feel like I wasn't invisible. Not once. Not ever." Emily took a breath before reading the last few lines. "And if he reads this, or if someone does, I only have one wish. Please don't forget me. That's all. Not the pain, not the sickness, just remember that I liked violets and books and telling stories, and that once someone kind came and helped me finish one." It was signed simply, "Love, Amelia." Underneath her name was a small sketch, a stick figure girl sitting under a tree, beside a taller figure holding a book. A bouquet of violets rested between them. Above, written in looping cursive, were the words, "He came back." Emily closed the folder gently, as if it were a sacred object. She sat in silence for a long time. Her office was quiet, the street outside muffled by distance and glass. But inside, her heart, something had changed. Not because she had uncovered a scoop or pieced together a mystery, but because she had seen a glimpse of something so human, so quietly noble, that it defied headlines. Keanu Reeves hadn't done this for recognition. He had done it for Amelia, for a promise, for a story that deserved to be finished. And for the first time, Emily understood what it meant to be remembered, not in fame or followers, but in silence, in violets, in stories whispered from one soul to another. She knew what she had to do next. The morning air in Silver Lake was cool and unusually quiet. Diego Santos stood near the edge of the maintenance shed, his cap pulled low over his brow. He didn't know why he was nervous. Maybe it was the anticipation. Or maybe it was because today marked exactly 1 year since everything had started unraveling. Emily Tran leaned against the outer wall beside him, a notebook tucked beneath her arm. She hadn't written a single word yet, but her mind was already full. She wasn't here to publish anything, not yet. She was here to witness something sacred. They both watched as a black SUV turned the corner at precisely 8:10 IAMA, just as it had the past 6 years. The tires whispered across the gravel path before coming to a stop in the usual spot beneath the old jacaranda tree. Keanu stepped out slowly, a bouquet of wild violets in one hand, the other tucked in his coat pocket. His expression was unreadable, but his posture slightly bowed, as if weighed down by something invisible, remained the same as every year. But today, something had changed. Another figure emerged from the passenger side of the SUV. A young woman, no older than 21, stepped out behind him. She had long, tightly curled dark hair tied into a loose braid and a small messenger bag slung over her shoulder. She wore a simple black cardigan over a navy blue dress. In her hands, she carried something wrapped in soft cloth. Emily stiffened. Diego's eyes narrowed in confusion. Keanu had never brought anyone with him before. The pair walked in silence toward the willow tree. Diego and Emily moved cautiously, staying partially hidden behind a hedge near the chapel wall. Keanu approached the gravestone first and knelt in his usual spot. He placed the violets carefully at the base of the marker, then rested his fingers against the smooth marble. His lips moved slightly, but whatever he said was meant only for Amelia. The young woman stayed standing a short distance away, her eyes fixed on the stone. After a few moments, Keanu reached back and gently motioned her forward. She approached, kneeling beside him. They sat in silence together for nearly 5 minutes. At one point, Keanu reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. She nodded softly. Then she unfolded the cloth in her hands. It was a thick, leather-bound journal. She opened to a page marked with ribbon and began to read aloud. Emily clutched her notebook tighter, straining to catch the words. Diego leaned slightly forward. The girl's voice was soft but sure. "It's the scene where the man returns to the hill," Emily whispered. "It's from Amelia's script." They listened in stunned silence as the young woman continued to read. When the reading ended, Keanu spoke to her quietly. They both stood, brushed the grass from their clothes, and remained still for a few moments, as if neither wanted to leave. Finally, as they turned to go, the girl noticed Diego and Emily near the hedge. She didn't look startled. In fact, she gave a faint smile and walked toward them while Keanu lingered by the car. "Hi," she said kindly. "You must be Mr. Santos." Diego straightened his posture. "Yes, I am." She extended her hand. "My name is Lily. I'm the first recipient of the Amelia Rivera Fellowship. Mr. Reeves thought it was time someone else came too." Diego wasn't sure what to say. The girl's presence felt surreal, like a thread from a different world had woven itself into their small cemetery in Silver Lake. But her voice was sincere, and her eyes, clear, focused, and quietly emotional, held no trace of pretense. "The fellowship," Diego said slowly. That's in Amelia's name?" Lily nodded. "Yes. Mr. Reeves set it up about a year ago. It's for students in the arts, writers, composers, performers who come from difficult backgrounds. I grew up in the foster system, kind of like Amelia. I've been writing since I was 10. Emily finally stepped forward. "How did you find out about Amelia? I mean, before all this?" Lily looked at her with a gentle understanding. "I didn't. Not until I met Mr. Reeves. I applied for a grant, thinking it was just a scholarship. Then I was invited to meet him. It was all very private. No press, no committee. Just him reading a stack of stories. He chose me because my final project was a short play about grief and memory." She paused, then added, "After he gave me the fellowship, he told me about a girl named Amelia. He didn't say much, just that she used to write, and that one of her stories reminded him of mine." Emily's throat tightened. "Did he show you her script?" Lily hesitated, then smiled faintly. "He let me read it. Just once. It was folded inside a journal he carries. There were lines in it that felt like someone much older had written them. Raw, hopeful, heartbreaking. The final scene, it stayed with me." She looked over her shoulder at the car, where Keanu still stood quietly, leaning against the hood, watching the willow sway in the light breeze. "Mr. Reeves told me he promised Amelia he'd remember her, but he also said remembering isn't enough. Her story had to mean something to someone new." Diego felt a lump rise in his throat. "And now it does," he said softly. Lily turned back to face the gravestone one last time. "It's strange," she whispered. "She died before I even knew who I was. But somehow, I feel like I've known her forever." They stood together for a moment in silence, the kind that speaks more than words ever could. Behind them, the trees rustled gently, and a bird flew low across the grass, then disappeared behind the chapel roof. Then Keanu approached. He didn't say much, just nodded at Diego and Emily, then rested a hand on Lily's shoulder. She gave him the journal, and he tucked it carefully into his coat. "Ready?" he asked her. Lily nodded. As they walked back to the car, Diego called out, "Mr. Reeves?" Keanu turned. "Thank you," Diego said simply. "For not forgetting." Keanu looked at the headstone, then back at Diego. "Some people," he said, "aren't meant to be forgotten." He opened the car door, waited for Lily to step in, then paused for just a second before sliding into the driver's seat. The SUV pulled away slowly, and for the first time in 7 years, Diego didn't feel the weight of unanswered questions. Instead, he felt the quiet warmth of understanding. Amelia's story hadn't ended. It had passed into new hands. Emily Tran didn't stop after the visit to the cemetery. The moment Lily mentioned the scholarship, something stirred in her. A quiet thread of hope woven through everything she'd uncovered so far. She returned home that evening and opened her laptop, surrounded by notes, screenshots, and scattered posts it scribbled with names and dates. But one phrase kept echoing in her mind: AR Films for Hope. She typed it into the search bar. Nothing official came up. No website, no articles, no registration under a film production company or foundation. Just a handful of vague references in obscure scholarship databases listing AR Films as a private arts grantor. No application page, no press releases, no photos. But something caught her eye. A PDF newsletter from a community college in Oregon, dated 2 years ago. Buried on the last page under Donor Spotlight, there was a paragraph about a first-year student named James, who had received a scholarship for creative writing excellence. His quote read, "The people at AR Films for Hope believed in my story when I thought no one ever would. I was about to give up. Then they sent me a letter, a laptop, and a copy of a short script called The Man Who Came Back. I read it 3 times. It changed everything. I felt seen." Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard. This wasn't just a scholarship. This was something deeply personal. She kept digging. Over the next 3 nights, she found 5 more scattered acknowledgments across community centers, youth foundations, and foster support newsletters in different states: Arizona, Ohio, Montana, Louisiana. Each recipient came from foster care. Each had been given full tuition to a writing program, along with basic living essentials. All of them mentioned one specific detail: the same script. In one testimonial, a student named Amari wrote, "It's about a man who visits a girl in a hospital. She's dying, but she teaches him to live again. He promises to come back every year to remember her. I don't know who wrote it, but it broke me open in the best way." Another young woman, Grace, wrote, "That little story was the first time I saw a version of myself that wasn't broken. I keep it in my journal. I reread it every time I start to doubt I can keep going." Emily leaned back in her chair. Her heart was pounding, but not from the adrenaline of discovery. From something else. From the quiet ache of knowing this was real. The legacy of a little girl who died with no family, no funeral crowd, and no obituary in the paper. Yet somehow, her words were now changing lives across the country. She opened a map of the United States and marked the locations of every confirmed scholarship recipient. There were more than she expected. Each one was tied to a community college or arts program. Some were from small towns. Others came from inner-city neighborhoods. None of them had known who R was, until now. Emily clicked open the scanned copy of Amelia's social worker file again. The initials, the red ink, the handwriting next to her name. It was the same as the signature on the fellowship check Rosa had shown Diego. All roads pointed to one person. Keanu Reeves didn't just remember Amelia. He turned her story into a lifeline, and he did it without ever asking for attention, applause, or even acknowledgement. Just silent action, patient, deliberate, and pure. Emily stared at the last quote she'd collected from a boy named Marcus in Kansas City. He was 17 and had just been accepted into a screenwriting workshop. His words were simple. "I think the man in the story is real. I don't know who he is, but I want to be like him someday." Emily printed out every story, every letter, every testimonial. She stacked them into a folder and placed the script copy on top. The script, The Man Who Came Back, had become more than a story. It was a thread connecting strangers who would never meet the girl who wrote it, but somehow felt her through every word, through every tear that script had once caused Keanu to shed beside her bed. She reached out to one of the scholarship recipients, a young man named Daniel from Denver. He answered her email with a short voice note. "Honestly," he said, "I never thought anyone saw me. I was couch surfing after I aged out of foster care. Then this envelope showed up one day at the center. It had my name on it. Inside was a laptop, an acceptance letter, and this small brown music box. It plays the quietest tune. No return address. Just a note. Keep writing. You matter." Emily's breath caught. The music box. That detail hadn't been in any scholarship database. It was something only someone close to Amelia would know. The kind of gift she had once held in that photo. The one Keanu had made for her by hand. He must have made more. Or kept them. Or recreated them for each student in her honor. This wasn't just memory, it was a mission. Emily traveled to the address Daniel gave her, a small arts building on the edge of the Denver campus. The director welcomed her warmly and led her to a display case in the hallway. Inside were past student projects, framed essays, and one locked box. It was the music box. A plaque read, "Gifted to our first recipient by an anonymous donor, 2023. Plays when opened. Story behind the music, unknown." Emily asked if she could open it. The director nodded. The tune that played was soft, haunting, beautiful, the kind of melody that made your chest tighten without knowing why. Emily didn't say anything. She just let it play. Later, on her way out, she noticed a poster pinned to the wall above the exit. It read, "AR Films for Hope Writing Contest. Applications now open." There's no website listed, just a single P.O. box in Los Angeles. She looked it up. It was registered under a generic name, Mosaic Holdings. But Mosaic Holdings was, in fact, one of the shell LLCs Keanu's legal team had used for privacy in past charitable donations. The dots were now glowing, not just connected, but undeniable. Keanu Reeves had created an entire hidden ecosystem for young writers who felt forgotten, just like Amelia once had. And in doing so, he had fulfilled the promise that little girl had once asked in a letter no one had mailed. "Promise me one thing. Don't forget me." He hadn't, not once. Every year he visited her. Every time he opened that script on set. Every time he sent out a music box, a laptop, or a handwritten note, he was keeping her voice alive. Not with a monument or a movie deal, but through people, through stories. Emily closed her laptop that night and sat in silence for a long while. Not everything had to be published. Some legacies weren't meant for headlines. Some were meant to be carried, quietly, fiercely, forever. At first, it was just one person. A teenager with a messenger bag and nervous hands stepped into the cemetery one cool morning, holding a single violet and a worn-out copy of a bound screenplay. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. She walked slowly, looking from headstone to headstone, until she found the willow tree. There it was, the modest gray stone that read, Amelia Rivera, 10 years old. She stood in front of it for a long time. The violet trembled in her fingers before she finally laid it on the earth and knelt down. From her bag she took out a folded note. She whispered something, pressing the paper flat against the stone. Then she left without a word. The next day, another visitor came, and a day after that, 2 more. By the end of the week, Diego counted 6 separate visitors who made their way to the same quiet spot. None of them stayed long. Some left wildflowers. Some left tiny figurines. But nearly all left notes. Folded pieces of paper, sometimes sealed in little plastic bags, sometimes handwritten in bright ink. Some were simple. One read, "Thank you, Amelia, I'm writing again." Another said, "You were braver than I've ever been." Diego didn't understand it at first. The grave had gone unnoticed for years. For so long it had been just Keanu. Just one man, one ritual, one loss. Now, something had shifted. Emily noticed it too. She returned to the cemetery that weekend with her notepad and a camera slung over her shoulder. But she didn't photograph anything. She sat at a respectful distance, watching from a bench nearby, letting the moment unfold. One girl in particular caught her eye. She was about 19, with purple streaks in her hair and a leather jacket covered in doodles. She walked confidently up to Amelia's grave and placed a tiny notebook next to the violet petals already gathered there. She spoke softly, not to Emily, not to Diego, but to Amelia. "I used to think no one would ever care what I wrote," she said. "Then someone gave me a copy of that script, The Man Who Came Back. They said it was written by a little girl who saw everything differently. It made me believe I could write something that mattered. Thank you." She touched the stone like it was a friend and walked away. Emily's heart stirred. It wasn't just a memorial anymore, it was becoming something else, something larger. She spent the next few days researching quietly, cross-referencing names of past Amelia Rivera Fellowship recipients with travel logs, social media posts, even scholarship essays. Patterns emerged. A few had posted cryptic captions, left a violet for the one who started it all, or went to meet the girl who gave me my voice. There was no publicity, no grand reveal, no hashtag campaign or viral post. It was entirely word of mouth, a movement built on whispers and memories. By the following month, Diego had quietly installed a small wooden bench under the willow tree. He didn't ask permission, he just did it. On the back, he carved a simple message by hand. For those who remember, visitors began to stay a little longer after that. Some sat in silence. Some read aloud from journals. One boy played soft violin music on his phone while sitting beside the grave, eyes closed, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. It wasn't grief exactly, not always. It was something gentler, something softer. Reverence, gratitude, a sense of being connected to something they couldn't explain. The violet flowers started to appear in bulk. At first it was a few petals, then full stems. One afternoon, Diego counted 24 fresh bundles. By now, he knew where they came from. There was only one flower that tied all these visitors together. The same flower Keanu had carried each year. The same one that had once rested in Amelia's tiny hands. People were bringing wild violets not because they were beautiful, but because they were symbolic. They were hers. One morning, Diego found something else. A sign. It hadn't been placed by cemetery staff. It wasn't official. It was just a small wooden stake, no bigger than a ruler, with a message painted in white letters. It told stories. One of them changed a man's life. Diego didn't know who had written it. He didn't need to. He left it there. Emily returned the following week with a notebook full of quotes, entries, and small interview clips. None of it was for publication. She'd made a decision. The story wasn't meant to be broadcast. It was meant to be preserved. She watched as a group of 3 scholarship students, 2 girls and 1 boy, knelt beside the grave in shared silence. One of them, a young man in a worn UCLA hoodie, pulled out a copy of The Man Who Came Back. He opened it to the first page and began reading aloud. It was Amelia's opening line. "There once was a man who didn't believe in second chances until he met a little girl who changed his world." His voice cracked midway through the sentence, and the 2 girls reached out, each placing a hand on his shoulder. They sat there, holding onto the moment, the words, the weight of something much larger than themselves. Later, when they stood up to leave, Emily walked over and gently introduced herself. "Are you part of the fellowship?" she asked. The young man nodded. "I got in 2 years ago. It saved my life." "How so?" He hesitated, then spoke with honesty. "I was in a bad foster situation. Thought college wasn't in the cards. Then one day I got this email from a program I'd never heard of. Tuition, laptop, everything paid. But the most important part?" He held up the worn script. "They sent this, and a note that said, 'You matter,' right like someone's listening." He looked toward Amelia's grave. She made me feel like someone already had. By summer, the grave had become something rare, a sacred place born not out of fame or spectacle, but out of a child's imagination and a man's quiet promise. The grass was always trimmed now. Someone always seemed to be tending the flowers. Tiny objects had been left behind, not clutter, but offerings. A pair of hand-folded origami cranes, a glittery pencil case with a note inside. "Use this to start something new." A single movie ticket stub with the words scribbled on the back. You would have loved it. No security, no press. Just people. People who had been touched by a ripple set in motion by a 10-year-old girl who once dared to dream. One afternoon, Diego came to the grave and noticed something new. A tiny, hand-painted ceramic figure of a man in a hoodie reading from a book. The figure was placed next to a miniature version of a little girl with a blanket over her lap and a notepad in her hand. They sat side by side on a bench, frozen in a moment that was both imagined and real. No one knew who made it. No one claimed credit. But those who saw it understood. She wasn't forgotten. Not by Keanu. Not by Diego. Not by the students whose lives had changed because of her story. Not by the people who came with violets in their pockets and hope in their hearts. Amelia Rivera had become more than a name on a stone. She had become a storyteller, remembered by other storytellers. And somewhere, in a trailer on a movie set, her story still sat in a safe drawer, waiting for its next moment to matter. Emily had seen film sets before. She'd walked onto them as a reporter, a researcher, even an assistant once during college. But this time felt different. She wasn't chasing a story, she was carrying one. One that had grown from a quiet grave into something far more powerful. She had followed it through whispers, records, faces, and names no one remembered. And now, the trail had led here. It was a warm afternoon in Vancouver, where Keanu Reeves was filming a small independent drama, far from the action roles that had made him famous. The crew had grown used to seeing him step away between scenes. Always calm, always respectful, always a little distant, as if he were walking through 2 worlds at once. With permission from the producer and a quiet nod from Keanu's assistant, Emily was allowed inside his trailer, just for a moment. She didn't expect much. Maybe a copy of a script, maybe that mysterious old notebook Rosa once described. But what she found was more than she ever imagined. The trailer was modest, clean, tidy. A worn leather couch lined one wall. There were no personal photos, no flashy gadgets, just a small shelf of books. And tucked between them, slightly crooked, was a slim, well-used folder labeled in faded pen, "The Man Who Came Back." Emily's breath caught. She reached for it carefully, as if afraid it might dissolve under her fingers. The cover was creased, the paper edges worn soft by time. Inside were pages typed by a child, uneven font sizes, misspellings, and bright purple ink. It was Amelia's story, her script, the one Maggie had spoken of. But it wasn't just the script. Pressed between the last two pages was a letter, folded with precision and stained faintly at the corners. The paper trembled slightly in her hand as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. She had seen it on charity checks and birthday notes he'd given fans. This was Keanu's handwriting, but the words, they were something else entirely. To whoever finds this, the letter began, I didn't save her. I think about that more than I should. When people call me generous or kind or say I do good things, they never see what I see. I see a hospital room, quiet as snowfall, with a little girl holding a music box she'd named after her favorite Shakespeare line. I see the way her eyes lit up, not because of me, but because she believed stories still mattered. Emily swallowed hard, the words catching somewhere deep in her chest. I visited her every week, not because I had something to give, but because she did. In her last weeks, she gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Wonder. Purpose. The belief that maybe our lives are still worth telling, even after they've ended. She told me once that the only thing worse than dying was being forgotten, that stories were how we remembered. So I made a promise. I promised I'd come back. Emily's eyes welled up as she continued reading. Every April 16th, I go to her grave not because I'm strong, but because I'm scared. Scared that if I skip even 1 year, the world will begin to forget her. And if they forget her, then they forget what she gave me, what she gave all of us. Her name was Amelia Rivera. She was 10 years old, she loved music, hated oatmeal, and dreamed of writing a movie that would make someone cry. I know, because I cried reading it. She titled it The Man Who Came Back. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. The script had followed every clue. It wasn't just fiction. It was Amelia's truth wrapped in the language of make-believe, her last story, her legacy. She turned back to the final part of the letter. This copy stays with me, on every shoot in every city. It reminds me why I started acting in the first place. Not for fame, not for money, but for the magic stories carry when told with a full heart. I made her a promise. I wouldn't let her be forgotten. So if you're reading this, it means you found the story too. And now it's your turn to remember her. Beneath the letter was no signature, just the initials, K.R. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, letting the silence breathe around her. Outside the trailer, crew members shouted directions and walked briskly past, unaware of the moment unfolding inside. But Emily didn't move. She gently refolded the letter and slid it back into the script where it belonged. The gravity of it pressed into her chest. Not just the words, but the weight of how quietly it had all happened. No articles, no press, no photo ops. Keanu had lived out this promise for years in silence. A man known by millions, carrying a story known by none. And that silence, she realized, was the most powerful part of it. It wasn't just grief. It was loyalty. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook. She didn't take notes. She didn't snap photos. Instead, she wrote one simple line on a blank page, tears slipping down her cheek. Some stories aren't meant to be broken. They're meant to be kept, passed, protected, like a letter inside a book, like a promise whispered at a graveside, like a little girl named Amelia, whose voice had reached further than anyone ever expected, because someone believed she mattered, and someone kept coming back. Emily Tran sat in silence, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. For weeks, she had lived inside Amelia Rivera's story, following the trail of whispers, photographs, volunteer logs, and tear-stained pages that led to one unshakable truth. Keanu Reeves hadn't just visited a sick child. He had kept her memory alive in ways the world had never seen. And now it was time to share that story, not to glorify him, but to honor her. She hesitated before typing the title. The Girl Who Saved Keanu Reeves. Not dramatic, not sensational, just honest. She began with the image she couldn't get out of her mind. A man in a hoodie reading aloud to a girl in a hospital bed, her hand curled around a music box. From there, she wove together the facts she had carefully verified: the quiet cemetery visits, the fellowship named in Amelia's honor, the scholarship fund hidden under a pseudonym, the letter tucked into a well-worn script. Every piece built toward a picture that was larger than either of them alone. This was a story about love that didn't fade after death, a promise kept, a child remembered. Emily was careful. She didn't reveal Amelia's full name until the final paragraph, and she made sure every person quoted had given permission. She included Diego's awe-struck recollections, Rosa's quiet memory of the man with the Shakespeare books, and Maggie Delano's words, "He didn't come to be seen, he came to see her." There were no clickbait headlines, no paparazzi photos, just truth, just heart. When she finally hit publish, it felt like letting go of something sacred, trusting the world to treat it with care. She closed her laptop and waited, but she didn't have to wait long. The story moved like a quiet wave through the internet. It didn't explode immediately. There were no dramatic headlines screaming for clicks. But within 24 hours, something began to shift. It started with the comments, not about Keanu, not about fame, but about Amelia. "I lost my daughter at 9. This story helped me believe someone else still remembers what that kind of love looks like. I was in the foster system. I used to write little stories too. I never thought anyone would care. Who was she? She must have been incredible." Then came the flowers. Violet bouquets began appearing at cemeteries across the country. Some were left at children's graves. Others were left anonymously at hospitals or foster homes. Many simply had a card attached. "For Amelia, for the forgotten, you are remembered." The article spread quietly through charity circles, foster youth organizations, and writer communities. It was emailed between nurses, posted on message boards by librarians, whispered between grief counselors and child psychologists. It made its way onto a segment of a late-night show, not because a celebrity was involved, but because of what the host said next. He paused after reading the final line of Emily's piece, the one where Amelia asked, "Promise me one thing, don't forget me." He looked into the camera and said, "Little one, the world just heard your voice." Donations to children's hospice programs tripled within a week. A dozen scholarship recipients who had received grants from AR Films for Hope finally understood where their opportunity came from. They reached out to Emily, grateful and emotional, wanting to honor Amelia in their own way. One of them, a young playwright named Serena, posted a video saying, "My first script is dedicated to Amelia Rivera. Because of her, I never gave up." And then, finally, the attention reached Keanu. But he didn't hold a press conference. He didn't issue a statement. Instead, he did something no one expected. He visited a community college in the Bronx, where one of the newest Amelia Rivera fellows was studying creative writing. Her name was Jada. Her hands trembled when she saw him walk into the room, carrying a copy of The Man Who Came Back. He sat beside her, placed the book between them, and said, "She believed in stories. And she believed in people like you. Keep going." Someone in the room took a photo. Just one, no flash, no crowd. Just Keanu and Jada sitting side by side, their hands resting on the same tattered script. That photo went viral, not because it featured a movie star, but because it said something deeper. The world had finally learned the truth. Not about a famous actor, but about a girl who, through her words, gave someone like Keanu Reeves a reason to remember, a reason to return, a reason to keep a promise for the rest of his life. And that's what made the story timeless. April 16th came again, just as it always did. But this time, the morning felt different. The air was thick with silence, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that holds something sacred. The small cemetery in Silver Lake, once visited only by birds and breeze, now had visitors walking quietly along its gravel paths. They didn't come for spectacle, they came to remember. Keanu arrived early, as always, 8:11 a.m. sharp. No cameras, no entourage. He walked alone, carrying the same wild violets he had brought every year for the last 7 years. But when he reached the willow tree, he paused. A soft gasp escaped his lips. He wasn't alone. Around Amelia Rivera's grave stood over 100 people. Young writers, foster youth, hospice workers, and strangers who had only read about her days before. Some carried flowers. Others clutched copies of a worn booklet titled "The Man Who Came Back." But all of them carried one thing in common: a sense that this girl, this forgotten 10-year-old, had somehow reached through the screen of their lives and changed something in them. A small wooden bench had been placed beside the gravestone. Simple, unadorned, it bore a single inscription burned into the wood: "For the storytellers, for the forgotten, for Amelia." A hush fell over the group as Emily Tran stepped forward, holding a thin stack of stapled pages in her hands. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. This was written by Amelia Rivera, page 1 of a script she dreamed would one day become a film. She read aloud the first few lines. A lonely man walks into a hospice room. He expects silence. Instead, he hears laughter. A little girl is waiting, not to be rescued, but to remind him what it means to care. Emily stopped at the last line. Came back because he promised. And some promises are forever. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Neither did anyone else. Near the back of the group, Keanu stood with his hands folded around the bouquet. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence had said more than any words could. He had kept his promise, quietly, fiercely, and completely. He had remembered. People began stepping forward, one by one, placing notes, folded paper, books, and flowers around the headstone. Some knelt to whisper, others just stood in silence. No one rushed, no one posed. It was a moment of unfiltered grace. And then a small girl, maybe 10, with a wild mop of curls and a pencil tucked behind her ear, walked up with a hand-drawn comic book. On the front, the girl who changed the ending. She didn't say anything, just placed it down and smiled at the grave like she knew Amelia somehow. Standing beside her mother, she whispered, "I want to be like her." The sun rose higher, casting long shadows from the willow branches that swayed gently above. The grave, once tucked away in obscurity, had become something more than a resting place. It was now a quiet monument, not just to Amelia Rivera, but to every child whose voice had gone unheard, every story lost in the shuffle, every dream that never saw a curtain rise. Diego stood near the path, watching it all unfold. He saw the way people lingered after placing their tributes, how they took a moment to read the engraving on the bench before walking away. A little slower, a little quieter. He thought back to the first time he saw Keanu whisper, "I didn't forget." Back then, he hadn't understood the weight of those words. Now he did. Nearby, Lily, the fellowship student, handed out small pamphlets with Amelia's story and a short message from Keanu. It read, "She asked me not to forget her. I didn't. I never will. If you're holding this, you're part of that promise now." Emily looked over and saw Keanu still standing where he had first arrived, now surrounded by people who didn't approach him like a celebrity, but like a fellow mourner. One young man hesitantly stepped forward, notebook in hand. Keanu nodded. They exchanged a few words, and the young man walked away smiling, holding the notebook to his chest like a treasure. The impact wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was soft, patient, lasting. Later that evening, the story Emily had written continued to ripple through the world. The Girl Who Saved Keanu Reeves was now more than a headline. It had become a movement of sorts. Not about fandom, not about fame, but about remembering those who are easy to forget. Classrooms began reading Amelia's story aloud. Foster homes printed her script and encouraged kids to write their own. Libraries requested copies of The Man Who Came Back to add to their youth writing sections. And the Amelia Rivera Fellowship received more donations in a week than it had in the previous 3 years combined. But no one spoke louder than the small inscription beside her grave. For the storytellers, for the forgotten, for Amelia. And on the anniversary the following year, it was etched into a bronze plaque below the bench, along with a new line added by a former fellowship student. Stories don't die when their authors do. They die when no one tells them. Thank you for telling hers. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that never make it to the screen. They live in the hearts of those who remember. And sometimes, a little girl with no family, no spotlight, and barely a voice can be the reason a man who's seen the world finds his purpose again. Now it's your turn. Have you ever met someone whose story deserved to be heard? Tell us in the comments. And what story would you like to see Keanu Reeves in next?